In the summer of 2014, a group of 4 friends undertook a cave diving expedition in the region of Costa Brava, Spain. Their destination was the Cova dels Arques. Despite its carefree nickname, the cave carries more ominous connotations. This was a place they should have never entered, but a desire to explore the unexplored swayed the group's opinion. So, they decided to go ahead with their plan to enter it. This is their horrifying story. Cova dels Arques, or Cave of Caskets, isn't particularly large by underwater cave complex standards. In fact, it's just 262 feet or 80 meters from end to end. It has a surprisingly simple structure too. Its entrance is 23 feet or 7 meters under the surface. The Cova dels Arques is popular with experienced divers, underwater photographers, and marine biologists who appreciate the unique geological features and the diverse wildlife inside and around the cave. Snorkelers and freedivers occasionally swim down to the cave's mouth as well, but few dare to venture inside for some very specific reasons. The truth is that Cova dels Arques is just too dark. No one really knows what's going on down there, and it's just very scary in general. It's not open to the public for safety reasons because people have died in there. That said, it's a magnet to those who want a real adventure and to explore the unknown. Divers who enter the cave must first swim along the floor to approximately 25 feet or 7.6 meters before starting up to a slight ascent toward a prominent hump. At the far end of the hump lies a rock-strewn entrance leading to another large, dark chamber. Maps of the cave do exist, but there's no record of anyone actually swimming into that second chamber. Needless to say, its size, dimensions, and topography are relatively unknown, and over the years, it's become a bit of an urban legend. On the morning of Saturday, July 19th, 2014, the sun energized the 4 friends as they finally embarked on the adventure that they had been thinking about for a while. They got together through a caving group, but none of them ever went into any serious caves, especially ones that were not explored and considered deadly. They were really excited to try something new and push their limits. Their excitement steadily increased as they took a boat over to the cave. Everyone was in a really good mood. This adventure was finally happening. It took them months of planning to finally get it all squared away. So this was a pretty big deal for them, and an adventure that they were hoping to be able to tell their friends about once the journey was over. They've all dived along the Costa Brava area before, but one of the things that really brought them to this cave in particular from all the other unexplored caves in the world was that this one allows for new discoveries to be made. There's scientists that actually want to know what's inside, and they'll work with the divers to kind of figure out their best plan of strategy for getting in the cave and getting out safely. The friends knew that cave diving was inherently risky, but it was the hint of danger that made it so alluring and addictive. They just couldn't get enough of it. It was kind of like adrenaline junkies that like to go skydiving or go wingsuit flying. When they arrived near the Cova dels Arques, Ricard and Denisio, 2 really good friends, and they had known each other for a long time, and a third unidentified friend, geared up, shared anxious glances, and slipped into the clear blue water. They wanted to explore, and it was happening. Meanwhile, the 4th friend stayed on the boat, and he was the one that if anything went wrong, he was going to find help to get his friends out. If there was a mishap or emergency, he could assist them and help get other divers in the area and alert authorities if needed. Early on, Ricard and Denisio and the other diver got their bearings and explored a few of the other grottos or caves in the area, after which they found themselves in the front of Cova dels Arques' submerged entrance. It kind of just popped up in front of them. They couldn't believe that they were finally here and going to enter into this cave. Even 23 feet down, the sunlight penetrated the water to such an extent that they actually felt safe exploring inside and around the small opening. They weren't in the cave yet, but they were going down to the entrance. Other than a few rays of dim light bouncing around inside, the interior was a forbidding abyss with no discernible form. They also noticed that inside, the walls were made of like a soft clay material and that the floor was covered in fine silt. This is a very bad thing for cave divers because if this silt mixes up, it blinds them and they literally can't see anything. In such conditions, divers often use a guideline outside the cave before entering. This is generally a common practice, but especially true when there's silt on the floor of the cave. Then if they lose visibility or become disoriented while inside, they can simply follow the rope out. However, Ricard and Denisio and the 3rd diver didn't have the rope. Someone forgot it when they were packing up and getting ready. This was a big mistake, but they kind of overlooked it and continued on. Faced with two choices, the third man realized that he was in over his head and told Ricard and Denisio that he was getting out of there. He didn't like the fact that they forgot the rope. He also thought it was a bad idea to go into the cave with the clay-like walls and the silt on the bottom of the cave floor. Everything was telling him to get out of there, and he tried to convince Ricard and Denisio that this would be an extremely dangerous dive to continue and that they should definitely not go. As experienced divers and longtime friends, they respected his decision to leave, but they were not going to listen to what he was saying. They had full confidence in what they were doing, and they considered the dive rope not a big deal because they've been in and out of caves before without using one, and nothing bad happened. And with that being said, they told their friends that it was going to be okay and they'll be fine on their own. After all, they knew that trusting your instincts was no sign of weakness. Ricard and Denisio took a long look at each other, gave a thumbs up, and then kept swimming inside. They hadn't come on this adventure just to turn back on the last minute. With that, they swam even further into the cave. Aided by their flashlights and reassured by the visible entrance behind them, they covered the first 115 feet or 35 meters with relative ease. It was beautiful inside, and things were perfect. The silt wasn't coming up, the clay-like walls weren't causing any problems, and they could still see some of the sunlight peering down into the cave. But with each foot they gained, their hearts beat more rapidly, with the darkness becoming more and more absolute. It was just eerie inside, and they kept looking back and forth at each other, kind of like, are we going to keep going or just bail on this whole trip altogether? But they just kept on going. Then, when they traveled to more than 260 feet or 61 meters into the cave, they simultaneously came to the same conclusion. They'd tempted fate enough for one day, and they really had to get out of there. They knew that if anything went wrong, even if the smallest amount of silt came up into their path, there would be a very slim chance that they could get out. Now it was time for them to head back to the surface. However, they had been so intent on what was ahead of them that they failed to realize that their fins had agitated a thick layer of silt on the cave floor. And now, as they turned to go, they could barely make out their hands just a few feet in front of their faces. This was their worst nightmare. They tried to reach out to grab each other, but there was nothing there. Worse yet, the sudden change in water clarity had caused them to lose their sense of direction, and with no rope or visible markers to guide them, they had no way of knowing where they came in. They could have just gone in any direction, and it probably would have just led them further down into the cave, which is where they would run out of air and die. Then it hit Denisio. He could swim around for hours and never find the entrance. After searching around for some time, the air in their tanks started to get dangerously low. They both knew that waiting for the silt to settle was not an option. It could take maybe hours, but sometimes days or weeks. They would basically just be waiting to their deaths, and surely they'd run out of air before the water cleared. It would be easy for them to just wait, but it's not an option. Then, when it seemed like all hope was lost, a slim ray of light pierced into the darkness above them. And Denisio thought in this environment, it could only be sunlight. Driven by desperation and the will to live, they swam towards it. As they approached, the light got brighter and brighter and even more promising. The crack was much larger than they originally had thought. In fact, it was slightly wider than their bodies. This was a miracle that never happens when you cave dive. They swam up and into the crack, hoping that by some stroke of luck it would widen and ultimately lead them to the surface. However, the further they went, the narrower this crack became. Eventually, they thought their progress would be halted altogether as the walls began pressing them tightly against their backs, chests, and arms. Meanwhile, they started to feel like they were never going to get out of this crack and die stuck in it. It looked increasingly likely like they had got stuck or come to a dead end, and they would run out of air and die a slow, painful death, gasping in the darkness. Miraculously, the passage remained just wide enough for them to squeeze through. They kept winding their way through, contorting their body as they went further and further into the crack. Somehow, they did eventually break through, but when they did, they were in an entirely different part of the cave that they were not expecting. At first, they weren't sure what was going on, but then they realized they broke into another cave that was running parallel to the CO.AG's cave. Their heads, shoulders, and arms were an 11.5-foot air pocket trapped at the top of a submerged cavern. Immediately recognizing their good fortune, they removed their equipment and breathed in the air. Denisio gave a horrifying look to Ricard because he knew that there could be carbon dioxide in the air and it could just kill them. But they got lucky and there was enough of a mix of air that they were able to breathe normally. With their lungs filled with air, a huge adrenaline rush came over them. Ricard and Denisio felt like they had just cheated death at the 9th hour. They even took photographs inside this little air pocket because they were so happy and wanted to remember it for when they got out. Now they thought to themselves, all they needed to do was sit tight and wait for their friends and the rescue divers to show up and save them. Meanwhile, outside of the cave, Ricard and Denisio's friends realized that something was wrong and called emergency services at 11 a.m. Luckily, officers from Spain's Civil Guard, or GEAS, were already on duty keeping an eye on the swimmers, snorkelers, and divers in the area. This was just another lucky break for them. Team leader Corporal Fernando Aguirre immediately began organizing a rescue party that he hoped would be able to get in the water by late afternoon or early evening. Because he knew the rescue would be challenging and potentially dangerous, he also activated the Civil Guard's National Diving Group. In addition, he enlisted help from marine biologists, underwater photographers, private dive centers, and lobster fishermen to find out what they knew about the Cova dels Arquets because there was just not a lot of information on it and he knew nothing about it in particular. Unfortunately, they couldn't give him much more information than he already had, which was basically nothing. One biologist did provide a sketchy map, but it didn't go that far and it ended in the silty cavern where Ricard and Denisio had gone missing. Corporal Aguirre and his team were relatively certain that Ricard and Denisio were somewhere inside the cave, but they knew from first-hand experience that most trapped divers don't live very long. He was hoping they were in an air pocket, but if that wasn't the case, there was no chance of rescuing them, so they were pretty sure that they were going to be doing a body recovery. Meanwhile, still trapped in that air pocket, Ricard and Denisio weren't sure how long the air cavern would hold out, or when the rescue operation would get underway. There was a limited amount of air that they could breathe, and after that, they would slowly start choking, feeling their lungs very heavy, and then eventually suffocate. In a cruel twist of fate, the act of them breathing was slowly killing them. As they inhaled and exhaled, the air in the cavern was being replaced by carbon dioxide. And this toxic byproduct was poisoning their already stressed bodies. To make matters worse, they were having trouble holding on to the cavern's slick walls. This meant that they had to tread water because the bottom was 24 feet down and there weren't any ledges to sit or stand on. This constant exertion increased their heart rates and breathing, which in turn sped up the physical and cognitive effects of the carbon dioxide poisoning they were beginning to experience. As the ordeal dragged on for what must have seemed like an eternity, the young men also began suffering from dehydration, hypothermia, and outright despair. Ricard was in worse shape than Denisio, but with their situation becoming more dire by the minute, they both largely resigned themselves to their grim fates. They didn't want to talk, they didn't want to look at each other, they just wanted to be silent in that cavern. Eventually, Ricard could barely keep his head above water, and on one or more occasion, he quietly slipped below the surface. And each time, Denisio summoned all of the energy in his exhausted body and would pull his friend back up. However, as the hours dragged on, the mental and physical stresses became too much to bear, and when Ricard slipped below the surface that last time, his friend wasn't able to come to his rescue. Ricard sadly just kept sinking. Now alone, trembling in the cold water and unsure if a rescue had been launched, Denisio came to the realization that, like his friend, it was only a matter of time before he died in the Cave of Caskets. Yet somehow, he was able to find it in himself to cling on to the hazy vision of a future in which he was once again surrounded by friends, loved ones, and fresh air. Yet, unbeknownst to him, Corporal Aguirre and a team of professional rescue divers had been in the water looking for him since 5 p.m. Shortly into their search, they were confronted with a nearly impenetrable wall of silt Ricard and Denisio had stirred up that morning. This was proof that they were on the right track, but even for professionals like Corporal Aguirre and his team, the dive was fraught with dangers. This rescue operation was extremely dangerous, and the rescuers could have easily died during their search. They made good progress early on, but in the silty water, they had no way of knowing which way the men had gone, where they had ended up, or if they were still alive. This was yet another cruel irony. The silty water was evidence that Ricard and Denisio had passed that way, but at the same time, it obscured them from the very men who they had come to save. It was like a wall that they were just not going to be able to get through. As night fell, the rescue divers came back to the surface. For Denisio, it was a night of utter terror, exhaustion, and despair. However, the search resumed early that following morning, and by then, dozens of journalists were on the scene to get information on the developing story. Experienced divers and search and rescue personnel from all over the country had arrived to lend a hand, but most knew that the likelihood of finding Ricard and Denisio was almost zero. Thankfully, the silt had finally settled by the time the divers arrived at the Cova dels Arques entrance that morning, but before entering, they anchored a dive line outside the cave. They weren't going to make the same mistake that Denisio and Ricard made. Then, as they swam into relatively clear water, they saw the same dim beam of glimmering light that Ricard and Denisio had seen the day before. Putting themselves in the missing men's shoes, they assumed that swimming toward the light would have been their only option. The first rescuer to enter the crack found it too narrow and tried to turn back. He was concerned that he was going to get stuck and not be able to get out. And then he realized he couldn't get out if he tried to go back. So he pushed through with everything he had and had to contort his body, and then continued upward and finally entered that chamber that Ricard and Denisio had been in. Sweeping the interior with his powerful flashlight, he immediately noticed Ricard's lifeless body floating in his neoprene wetsuit. He assumed that he'd find Denisio's body next, but to his surprise, he was clinging precariously to a jagged rock on the far side of the cavern. When he realized that he was no longer alone, he let out an agonized moan that startled Corporal Aguirre and the other rescue diver. Denisio had somewhat managed to stay alive under the impossible conditions, but he was so exhausted, dehydrated, hypothermic, and disoriented that his survival was far from certain. The fact that he was still alive was great, it was what they hoped for, but getting him back out of the cave would be another massive challenge, and getting him out alive wasn't looking good. And even with salvation so close, Denisio refused to put on the air tank that they had brought to him. He was just delirious and had no idea what was going on. He was fighting the rescue divers and thought that they were trying to harm him. He had no idea that they were there to help him. Corporal Aguirre realized that Denisio didn't understand where he was, how he got there, or who the rescuers were, so he simply refused to cooperate. Fearing that he'd only respond to someone he knew, Corporal Aguirre hastily returned to the surface and convinced Denisio's diving friend who came with him to accompany him back into the cave to save Denisio. He wasn't sure about it, but he decided he had to do it. He knew how dangerous this rescue mission would be for him, but it was the only thing that could be done to save Denisio. So he followed Corporal Aguirre into the cave with some other rescue divers and worked his way down to where that air-filled cavern was. Finally seeing a friendly and familiar face did improve the situation, but by that afternoon, Corporal Aguirre decided to sedate Denisio because time was running out, and he knew it was the only way they'd be able to get him out alive. Then, no more than 24 hours after he had gone into the cave, Denisio finally broke the surface, accompanied by Corporal Aguirre, the team of rescue divers, and his friend. Now that Denisio was safe and sound, they had to go back in to recover Ricard's body. Denisio was the first diver in Spain to survive such an accident, and when the media frenzy died down, Corporal Aguirre launched a thorough investigation to determine why the dive ended in tragedy. It was surprising that Ricard died from carbon dioxide poisoning, which is also known as hypercapnia. However, Corporal Aguirre's final report noted that none of the divers had the necessary training or experience to undertake such a challenging dive. In addition, they ignored or were unfamiliar with basic safety precautions like installing a dive line that would have guided them to safety through the silt-ridden water. Some even called out Denisio for not saving Ricard from drowning. However, Corporal Aguirre's report noted that he'd already saved his friend multiple times, but that in the end, he just didn't have enough strength to prevent him from drowning. Denisio ultimately made a remarkable recovery. And that's it for today, and I appreciate you watching until the end. If you found this story both fascinating and heartbreaking, please be sure to show some love to the like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. Hope to see you at the next one.